It's been nearly a year since Assassin's Creed Valhalla launched back in November of 2020, and the subsequent months have been kind of rocky for the latest release in Ubisoft's flagship franchise. The game has been continuously plagued by glitches and performance issues, and the additional content has ranged from kinda cool to pretty negligible. The Siege of Paris, Valhalla's latest expansion, has been Ubisoft's attempt to bolster the game's reputation and give the fans the substantial, worthwhile content they've been waiting for since release about a year ago. The expansion sees Eivor in a more urban environment with a refined focus on exploration and stealth, and so on paper this seems like a step in the right direction. So the only question ends up being, did they stick the landing? I'm Jay from The Bakery, and I'm trying to help you find out if Assassin's Creed Valhalla, The Siege of Paris, is right for you.
Francia, the land of Charlemagne, and the bitter price of Ragnar, who sacked Paris for a fortune in silver and sorrow.
The Siege of Paris sees Eivor travel to Francia during the reign of Charles the Fat, in an attempt to dissuade Frankish forces from setting their sights on England. Eivor finds herself at odds with both the Franks, who treat the Northerners with even more hostility than the Saxons of England did in the base game, and the Viking forces led by Siegfried, who rebuke Eivor's calls for diplomacy in their desire to burn Paris to the ground. The story is very simple, and it plays out a lot like one of the regional story arcs from the main game, just at a larger scale. Now, the previous expansion, Wrath of the Druids, also took this approach, but I feel like that story was much more fleshed out than what we got here. Wrath of the Druids only had a couple characters who really mattered, and all of them had complete arcs and grew as people as the story progressed. The Siege of Paris is much grander than the last expansion, and it throws a lot more characters into the mix, but one of the results of that is the characters end up feeling very shallow and forgettable. Eivor's primary allies are Siegfried and Toka, Siegfried's niece who lost her uncle, and Siegfried's brother, in the war with the Franks. The clash of Siegfried's bloodthirsty need for revenge with Eivor's desire for peace had the makings of an interesting dynamic, but it fizzles out before anything really interesting happens. As a result, Siegfried failed to leave a real lasting impression. Toka is a constant presence in the DLC, and yet I didn't find her that interesting either. She's this warrior mourning the loss of her father and searching all of Europe for a champion to help her save her people, which is a really cool setup, and so it's a shame that she feels so generic when you're actually face to face with her. The villains fare a little better, with Eivor's most notable adversary being Count Odo, a powerful Frankish military leader, and Charles the Fat, the king of the Franks, who appears less and less in touch with reality as the story progresses and his mind deteriorates. These characters are a lot more interesting than most of the cookie-cutter villains we saw in the base game, and they definitely outshine the villains of Wrath of the Druids. Odo's ambitions for himself are outshined only by his love for his home and his people, making him Eivor's best chance at a diplomatic resolution to the conflict. Charles, meanwhile, is portrayed as menacing and unhinged from the moment you meet him, and he becomes more interesting as the story plays out. However, all these stories end in a kind of unsatisfying way, partly due to the increased importance of choice in this DLC. Now, I didn't like that Wrath of the Druids had almost no meaningful choice options to change the course of the story, which was actually an issue I had with Valhalla in general, especially compared with Odyssey, which had some really interesting places that your path could diverge from someone else's playthrough without compromising the integrity of the story. In the Siege of Paris, Eivor has a lot more choices to make, and the characters of Siegfried, Odo, and Charles will have vastly different endings depending on what you decide to do. But the expansion just doesn't handle this very well, and a lot of these choices lead to half-baked payoffs that don't hold a lot of weight. I would have personally preferred if they had held back a little on the decision-making and instead developed concrete story arcs for these characters, which would have added to the consistency and allowed for more cool set pieces and character moments. Instead, there really isn't a character in this expansion that's going to stick with me. Now, outside of the characters, the plot is very run-of-the-mill, and it doesn't have the twists and turns of the main game or Wrath of the Druids. I found it to be a fun side adventure, but it wasn't the big character-changing quest I was hoping it would be. There is one aspect of the game that is absent here, and that is the presence of a shadow organization seizing control of the populace, whether that be the Templars or the Order of the Ancients or even the Children of Danu. Having an enemy faction like that and an assassination tree for the last few games is a staple of the franchise, and its absence is very noticeable. One criticism some people had of Odyssey was the lack of a defined Assassin-Templar conflict, but I actually thought it did a pretty good job of portraying a hero who fights for freedom by assassinating members of a secret organization who installed agents in positions of power around the country. While I understand why it might not connect with the themes of the older games enough to satisfy some people, Valhalla actively felt like a step in the wrong direction in that respect. Valhalla's base game felt like a series of diplomatic missions with some Assassin's Creed lore sprinkled in at intervals that were just too few and too far between. The Siege of Paris does not remedy this, and despite the newfound focus on infiltration missions, this actually felt like the least Assassin's Creed-esque story yet, in my opinion. The lack of real Assassin-Templar elements makes this story feel unimportant in the grand scheme of the franchise. Now, there is this group of enemies known as the Bellatores Dei, who seem like they are going to be set up to fill this void, but they end up being entirely forgettable after they initially piqued my interest. Honestly, this group could have been entirely cut from the story and the writers would not have had to change much, which makes them feel like an afterthought to appease fans of the series. Now, overall, the story isn't bad, but it's very inconsistent and oftentimes forgettable, which really isn't what Valhalla needed after a year of mediocre add-on content. I didn't dislike the story, but I found myself disappointed by how little I cared about this content, whether it be the shallow characters, the simple main plot, or the poor attempts to tie into the rest of the series.
Rush the palace gates! We will bring the whole place crashing down on Odo's skull!
The game makes very few changes to how Eivor plays, so all the goods and bads carry over from the base game. As far as combat goes, the biggest change is the inclusion of one-handed swords shortly before the DLC was released. Now, this is something that the game 100% should have had at launch, but it is better late than never. A lot of people are just going to want to have the short sword for the sake of role-playing, and it does fulfill that role. However, I must say I was very disappointed by the gameplay in general. While the sickles in Wrath of the Druids felt more grounded in their animation than other weapons, the swords once again go back to that over-the-top, cartoony style. In addition to this, they share their kill animations with the one-handed axe, which feels incredibly lazy. The swords don't add anything to the gameplay really, and I was disappointed by that. A number of passive abilities have also been added to the game, most notably the fact that health will now regenerate over time to an extent. Now, I play this game casually, on normal, and this made the game way easier than it was before. I actually didn't end up using rations once my whole playthrough because of how overpowered Eivor will be once you level her up all the way to 466. Now, one thing that does improve a bit is the stealth. Kind of. They haven't actually fixed the awful stealth mechanics of the base game, and the enemy detection is still very broken. However, there is a significant decrease in focus on traditional stealth in favor of infiltration and finding clues. Eivor has several missions that involve sneaking into an area and killing a target, a la Assassin's Creed Unity and Syndicate. Now, I totally thought these were also going to be half-baked attempts to cater to fans who missed that aspect of the series, but these missions were honestly really fun. In fact, some of them outshine some of the black box missions of Unity in their creativity and layout. A cloaked-up Eivor searches a wide-open area for clues that will lead her to her target, and there are usually multiple ways of handling each assassination. Unfortunately, there are really only a small number of these missions, and they're not replayable, which is a huge dig against them. There are some special opportunities and clues you can follow in these missions, but if you do miss them, there is no way to go back and try again. It would have added so much replayability if we could have just gone back and tried new ways of tackling these missions. However, for what they are a good time, and since most of your time is spent prowling around distrust areas with your cloak on, the terrible stealth and detection mechanics don't really get in the way of these missions. I will say though, social stealth overall is still a joke. Blending is almost never useful due to a lack of opportunity to use it, there is no crowd blending, and the amount of fun I had with the infiltration missions only made me wish they tried harder to make social stealth enjoyable. This is somewhat of a theme with Valhalla. The game brings back these old gameplay concepts, but it does so in a way that neuters their impact, in my opinion causing them to showcase the limits of Eivor's controllability. Another example of a half-baked mechanic is the free running. Paris is more urban than any other city in Valhalla or even Odyssey, although I wouldn't say it matches Alexandria from Origins. It feels great to have so much verticality and to be able to cross from one end of a district to another without touching the ground, but at the same time, you can tell Eivor wasn't built to be able to handle that kind of travel. Constantly, I will point Eivor in a direction, and instead of jumping to the next building, she will hop back onto the ground. Because of the way the character is designed, if she can't make it to the next one-story roof, she just falls to the ground. But Paris isn't just one-story roofs, and so it feels so unsatisfying for Eivor to miss a jump just because the game isn't built for that kind of free-running. The layout of the city should have been adjusted more to match Eivor's abilities, because as it stands there are clear linear paths of rope and posts that the game sets up for the player, and while you don't have to follow them, failing to follow them sometimes does showcase the issues in Eivor's controls. Verticality is also rarely used in the game. Being high up has very few benefits aside from the fun of being able to run on the rooftops, but you're never going to stalk enemies from above or really use the high ground to your advantage in an urban area. Like so many of Valhalla's callbacks to the old games, this feels very superficial due to the lack of effort into integrating the old with the new. More stealth options shine a light on the failings of the stealth system. A bigger city shines a light on the failings of the traversal system. The short sword feels lazily implemented. They even included a bunch of new mounted enemies in a game where mounted combat has mostly been removed from the franchise, so fighting these enemies feels more awkward than challenging. So many aspects of this expansion seem to be hearkening towards mechanics from the past that people have been asking to come back, but they are done in such a lazy way that poorly adapts these mechanics to the existing structure of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Now that being said, I did overall enjoy Paris as a city. It just wasn't as grand as I was hoping for. Francia is really just more of the same, with rolling hills and green fields, and more of the same was not what I was looking for in this DLC. So if you were looking for a meaningful change to the formula, that's not something you're going to find here. So, with all of this in mind, who exactly is the Siege of Paris for? Well, if you enjoyed Assassin's Creed Valhalla at launch and you got a lot out of Wrath of the Druids, this really is more of the same. It has everything that made the original game fun, with a new story and map, so it will be more than enough to whet your appetite for more of this game. Also, if you have a general interest in 9th century France, this could be a must-have. But that leads us to who this isn't for. For me, this expansion really was too little, too late. After a year of mediocre add-on content, this game needed to make some big changes. But instead, the Siege of Paris is almost clinical in how little it really changes. It has been a year, and Eivor's cloak still comes off when detected, enemy detection is still broken, and glitches are still constant. Things people have been asking for changes to since before release are still present. The game just hasn't improved in any meaningful way, and I think it's worth noting that regardless of what you thought of Odyssey, 1 year after release, that game had a huge array of new and fun content to explore that Valhalla barely has a fraction of. If you were someone giving this game the benefit of the doubt and waiting for things to get better, unfortunately they just haven't at this point with the Siege of Paris. And for me, we have reached a point where a lot of the problems that I have with the game probably aren't going to change. And instead of being a commitment to progress, the Siege of Paris was a reminder of the stagnant pool of awkward controls and game-breaking glitches that have plagued this game for a full year. Those are my opinions on the Siege of Paris. Hit the bell and subscribe for more content like this, and let me know what your favorite expansion was for any of the Assassin's Creed games. I know I mentioned in my Wrath of the Druids review that I really like the Jack the Ripper DLC from Syndicate, because I really enjoy time jumps, but otherwise, have a great day, and take care of yourself.